Stop being curious. Curiosity. Kill the cat. Are you a cat?
All right, guys, we're losing him. We're losing him. Hello, number ones. Welcome to Metatron's Academy. So here's a question for you today. How did ancient people learn languages? Like, think about it. Foreign language acquisition is something that we kind of take for granted, mostly because in our day and age, all you really need in order to learn a language is, first of all, the will to do it and some time. But apart from that, not only our world is extremely interconnected these days, you can fly to places very easily that people in ancient times didn't even know they existed, never mind having easy access to. But also you can find people to speak. Cities are a lot more cosmopolitan than they used to be. And last but not least, of course, we have the ability to use the power of the internet and extreme connectivity that it grants for us to interact and find people that speak the language that is our target, and therefore to be able to practice. And on top of all that, there is a lot of resources today. There are so many resources in the sense of online courses and YouTube videos. And in fact, theoretically, you could learn an entire language without even having to spend any money apart from the money you need to pay your internet bills. So all of this, learning a language is definitely not a monumental task. It's difficult, it takes time, depending on the language you learn. It isn't easy. However, it's not an insurmountable goal because of how much technology has facilitated the process. Dictionaries can be bought anywhere. But what about people in ancient period? I mean, imagine an ancient Roman, for example, wanting to learn or having to learn a Celtic language. Or imagine, in fact, a German having to learn to communicate with their new overlords because, I mean, maybe they lost in that area, the town, and now the village is under Roman control and they have to pay taxes. Well, you have to communicate. How did ancient people learn without having access to the internet, to media, to dictionaries, to anything? There was no formalized language education in a structured sense whereby anyone could just pick up a book and learn. How do you do it? Clearly, ancient language learning was fundamentally different from modern approaches, relying heavily on immersion, practical necessity, and oral tradition rather than formal classroom instruction. The thing that we really have to focus on as we try to make this into a realistic scenario is that most ancient people learned additional languages through direct contact and necessity. So, for instance, trade routes like the Silk Road created multilingual hubs, where merchants, translators, and local populations naturally acquired multiple languages through daily interaction. Also, port cities, whether it be in Europe, whether it be in the Mediterranean, Northern Africa, Middle East, border regions, and trading posts became linguistic melting pots where people absorbed new languages organically through commerce, negotiation, and social exchange. Now, while we can imagine all of this, so we can understand how they may have approached the solution to the problem of foreign language acquisition, still, if you're learning as an adult, it must have been very difficult to do. Because, once again, yeah, you can speak to people, you could learn to trade with people effectively, but that doesn't mean that you're fluent in the language. There will be a lot of other instances where you wouldn't have a clue what they're saying if it's outside the bubble in which you're learning said language, right? And even if you're someone who just, you just loved it when those Portuguese were popping by your port in Genoa, and so you speak Genoese, not even Italian, in fact. Whenever they come around, you love to go and hang out with them, and how do you say this, how do you say that, and you look at pointed things and learn a few things. Sure, great. There is a certain ceiling that you can reach of proficiency when you learn either in an instanced bubble or in sporadic interaction. There is a way to solve this, and that is becoming bilingual. So, a lot of the translation and communication between peoples, and this probably goes all the way back to the Stone Age. However, it is the Romans who are the first methodical applicators of the concept of making sure someone on your side is raised bilingual, or that you get someone from the other side and get them to learn Latin at a very early age. Systematically, they are the ones that we know implemented it, but there's no reason to believe that people didn't do it in much older civilizations, such as, for example, Sumerians or Akkadians, and possibly even earlier than that. Ideally, what the Romans did is that the best translator is someone who already knows the language as a child. In fact, the idea of the critical years of language learning, which is usually all the way up to age 6 or 7 in order to be a true bilingual. In fact, the first 3 years of age, this is debated in the language community, but in general, even up to age 6 or 7, you can reach extremely high levels, even if it's not technically bilingual. And then particularly talented individuals can learn to be almost identical in skill to a true bilingual, even if they learn and they are like 12. But in general, the Romans absolutely understood the critical importance within language learning of learning as a child, so infancy. And so they took advantage of that. Either they took, by force, I understand, but either they took children from communities, like for example, the son of the chieftain, took him by force, bring him back to Rome, raise him in Rome. Imagine the child being like 9 or 10, so they are already native, possibly like 10, they're already native of that language, but now they move to Rome, and as children, their brain is malleable, and therefore they will learn Latin just because they live there, full immersion. And then by the time this person is 20, now they speak both languages fluently, natively, and then the Romans use them as translators. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. This is something that we did as well with, for example, the discovery of America, or from the European perspective. So as the crowns, European crowns and powers, whether it be Spain, Portugal, as they go to modern day America, and then they interact with the natives, then of course taking people and bringing, possibly if they're young, taking them back to Europe so they learn the languages, our languages, and then you use them as connections is in fact the best way to do this. Alternatively, you can have some of your kids, you bring them with you, you establish a colony in an area. The Romans did this a lot. And then your children mingle with people who speak the language, and therefore they also learn the language because the area is multilingual. This is also something that was done. For instance, look at a Celtic place such as Parisi. Parisi is the Celtic name of Paris. The Romans renamed it into Lutetia. Eventually, the name was reverted back into the original Celtic ones, as we use the modern term Paris. As it becomes, it was already an established location. It was a settlement. It was Celtic. But then as the Romans take over, they begin digging operations. They start getting all of the limestone from the deposits underneath the town and use that stone to begin the building in stone, which was the characteristic of the empire and the republic. Of course, now they move in a certain number of people that speak Latin to populate the area. And so now you have an area where they speak a Celtic language and they speak Latin. And of course, even though there might be difficulty of communication between adults, the kids start learning, and so eventually the new generation will be able to communicate and speak. And of course, as long as you have one person who can do that, then they can teach, right? So even as an adult, you could be a general, in fact, a Roman legatus, and you could be like, well, you speak German, how do you say this? So you ask them to teach you some things. Now, usually given Roman aristocrats and politicians usually were not interested in learning languages that they considered barbaric, so there is that. But there are exceptions. In fact, there is a mention of at least one ancient Roman politician who was fluent in a Germanic tongue, simply because he was interested, he wanted to learn it, and he enjoyed the process. In fact, he's made fun of in the Senate, usually because of that. And that really because the Romans only considered Latin and Greek to be languages worth of learning. With that being said, it doesn't mean that that's always applied, and it doesn't represent the aristocracy, the upper class does not represent the people. And so general population may have had interest in learning at least a certain degree of languages. Now, it wouldn't be uncommon to have people who spoke multiple language. What would have been rather rare is for people to be extremely good at it. But those existed. And usually the way this was achieved was beginning in a very early stage and with full immersion. Because full immersion is the way to do it even today. It's just that we tend not to do it. In fact, our system of language learning at school is not optimized. If anything, we are not using the full immersion system that the ancients did use. And as I was saying, even if we go back to, like, for instance, the Sumerians, 100%, I mean, again, Akkadian and Sumerian being two unrelated language, one being a language isolate and the other one being a Semitic language, definitely there would have been some overlap, and definitely there would have been speakers who spoke both. And those people most likely utilized systems of immersion and cultural exchange and linguistic exchange, usually due to not just interest, but sometimes also necessity, as we were saying, in order to achieve true fluency, which is absolutely achievable, even though it's definitely harder in period. When it comes to oral methods and memory techniques that the ancients would have used, of course, literacy was limited, and therefore in a lot of tribal communities, ancient language learning relied heavily on oral methods. You can imagine students or children memorizing vast amounts of poetry, speeches, texts in the foreign language, utilizing storytelling, songs, and poetry, serving as a primary vehicle for language transmission. And this shouldn't really surprise us, because cultural transmission and even historical transmission all happens with storytelling and oral traditions. And this is something that goes all the way back to prehistory and how we originally transferred knowledge from one generation to the next. Writing and reading is a fairly recent invention when you look at the entirety of human history. Alright, number ones, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have other questions, feel free to ask, and thank you for joining Metatron's Academy. Bye.